I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. Iris and Siri are some of the most extraordinary people I've ever worked with. So obviously when they asked me to do this, I was like, of course, just tell me where and when. So I was going to start off, and we will get on to PowerPoint in a little bit because, got to be done, sadly. But we're going to start off without the slides, if that's okay. And I'm going to start off. I was asked to speak a little bit about what it is like as, having the life of a chief diversity officer. That is the life. No, obviously it isn't actually. I mean, no one ever wanted to speak to those of us that worked in diversity for a very long time. Diversity was always like something that really triggered people either to roll their eyes and have a conversation, about, oh, you're there to get Black people jobs through affirmative action. It was either kind of like that kind of approach, or it was, we don't have time for that. It's not a priority. Or it was just a complete blank of like, what is that? What even is that then? And it's not a surprise, certainly in the tech industry, when people say, what even is that then? Because you look around and tech is not known for its diversity, equity, or inclusion. But I do hope that will change. I myself have found in my life as a chief diversity officer that there is just like a ton of really extraordinarily good work going on. There are deep pockets of excellence and achievement, but overall, we are failing. So, I don't want to throw everyone under the bus, myself included. We work really hard. But the life of a chief diversity officer really is about persuading others to change how they think and change how they behave. And that can be difficult, frustrating, and sometimes pointless, because it's amazing how well wired the human brain is, and we're creatures of habit. We also have these biases, as you all know, built in. We all do. They're the shortcuts that enable us to take the, what is it? I always forget the statistic. Is it? It's something like 250,000 decisions a day in a blink of an eye that we take, and we do a lot of that through these shortcuts, which are essentially stereotypes. So yeah, my job is trying to tell people and persuade people and show people that if they were to think differently and behave differently, then we could get different outcomes. And the outcomes that we're looking to change, as you'd expect in the tech industry, are around three key areas, and really most industries, I mean, any business. So it's, first of all, how do we get a more diverse workforce? Then secondly, how do we have a more inclusive culture? Because there's no point just getting people from underrepresented groups into a workplace. You have to be able to retain them there as well. And then how do we get a more inclusive product? Like, what are we building? What are these products that impact hundreds of millions, even billions of people around the world? And how do we make them more inclusive so that they work for all? So I'd say my average day is really around those three areas, though it's never the same thing, is it? But those three areas, like, wow, I look at Snap's tech team. I finished up last week with several meetings with the person who runs engineering at Snap, and we really are like heads down going, okay, how are we going to change the statistics that show that only about 20% of our tech workforce at Snap are women? I mean, that remains a very shocking fact to me. I mean, even though I know it very well. I mean, when I was in Parliament, I was elected in 1997, and 20% of the MPs there were women. It was funny though, because the day before I was elected, the number of women MPs there was 10%. So the next day, because the numbers doubled, basically there was this expectation that all these new women, like all of us being still only a small minority, but all these women would change the way Parliament operated the culture, the legislation. And when that didn't happen overnight, or even, I mean, I was this morning in a meeting earlier this morning with SNAP's UK office, and we were reflecting on the fact that today 35% of Britain's MPs are women, but often around the world it hovers between 20 to 35%. You know, it's usually around a fifth or a third. Quite often you think, my goodness, really, 2022, it's still so hard for us to do what the ancient Greeks were talking about, representative democracy. Now, of course, they had a few systemic issues with their democracy, not least slavery. I mean, America also is still dealing with some of the fallout from just deep, inbuilt systemic prejudice, bias, and inequity. So, of course, we're not going to change all those things overnight, but really it is my job each day to be thinking, how am I going to change who's working at this company? How am I going to change the environment that people work in so they feel they belong? Because why are the attrition rates, you know, the rates at which people leave the tech industry are always higher for women and underrepresented groups? Why is that the case? What can we do to change that? And then, like I said, and hey, what about these products? What are we going to do to make sure that they are more inclusive? For example, I work for Snapchat. You're the right demographic group. You know what I'm talking about when I say Snapchat. I think most of you do. When I go to my colleagues in the House of Lords, I'm very lucky to benefit from a bit of feudal privilege. I go to them and I'm like, oh, I'm at Snapchat. And they're like, what? I remember when I told them I was leaving Parliament to go to YouTube, they literally were like, you who? Like, what is that? Uh, so I know you get that. Snapchat, for example, we just, like a result of something my team was working on, we just introduced the first Bitmoji stickers, avatars, etc. So you can have wheelchair Bitmojis. So you can introduce, representing people with disabilities who didn't get that representation before. That's like one example of some of the things we do. And you know, I wanted to, I was asked to talk about life as a chief diversity officer. It got particularly spicy last week, and in fact, the last couple of weeks, because Iris had mentioned, for example, the last legislation that I introduced to Parliament was to require all UK companies with over 250 employees to publish their gender pay gap. Now, the legislation wasn't perfect. I'll say that myself. There were different things I wanted to get across the line, but at the time, this was 2016, my party was not in power, is still not in power. And so this is really similar to what a chief diversity officer does. It's like, well, how are you going to change the rules if you're not the one in power and it's not your system? Like for me, how am I going to change the systems we use in the tech industry for recruiting, which often have biases built into them, when I don't own the recruiting systems? So obviously I have to go and be best friends, busy mates, as we might say in the UK, with the person, the people, the teams that are owning the recruiting systems, that are owning the internal HR systems, that are owning the product development systems, and have these conversations to essentially try and persuade them to change. So yeah, in 2016, I was trying to persuade other MPs across the political spectrum that we should have this transparency, because I argued that it would, at the very, some people said, well, what's the point? Literally, what is the point? You're not telling them they have to increase increase either the number of women or reduce the pay gap. You're just saying they need transparency. What's the point? Well, I think we've learned there's always a point in transparency, and I'll tell you in a minute what it is. But in this particular case, for me, but at the time, yeah, I couldn't get the perfect legislation through. What we decided to do in the end was just say, all right, what is the gender pay gap? You've got to remember that gender pay gap, that is different to pay equity. Pay equity is, if you're a man or a woman or any other different identity, you get the same pay for the same work, right? Same pay for same job. That's pay equity. We have pay equity more or less at Snap, as do most of the reputable or larger companies in the world. Most companies today, and sorry, I'm not unclear, there are a ton. I'd like to know what the breakdown is actually. I don't know that. Maybe someone at Harvard Kennedy School will know that. We'll be able to find out what is the breakdown of jobs of those that are companies that do the right thing in this instance, at the very least, which is always to pay, equal pay. So, if you're a man or a woman at Snap in the engineering department and you're the same level, you get the same pay. I mean, there are pay bands, but within that pay band, you will be getting the same amount. And those pay bands are there to ensure that you don't have any of these big outliers. Oh, because so-and-so is, the VP's son-in-law or whatever it might be, right? So, the conversations that I had in Parliament were saying, actually, we can't get that across the line for this piece of legislation. But what we will do is we'll just make all the companies add up all the men they have and everything they pay them, and all the women they have and everything they pay them, and divide, the stat for the men by the number of men and the stat for the women by the number of women. And that's how you get a gender pay gap, right? It's not saying that different people are earning different amounts for the same work, which is really important to remember. So what really my piece of legislation was doing was saying, hey, we're going to highlight who gets paid the most. And guess what? The people who get paid the most are the people in the most senior positions. I realize I'm not teaching you anything with that piece of information, but here's the kicker. When you do it like that, the gender pay gap, we just did it at Snap. I did, when I told them it was my legislation, they nearly had a breakdown. Well, not really, but they're like, oh my God, it's you're the reason we're having to spend all of this time talking about this, and you're the reason we look terrible. And the reason we look terrible, and it is terrible, is that the same for Snap, the same for most elements of the tech industry, the women are in the lower paid jobs. And even when they are in engineering, they're in the lower levels disproportionately, right? And if you take our top quartile earners, only 15% of our top quartile earners at Snap are women, right? Compared to 85% men. Now, we've been really open and transparent about that. And the result is we have got a really big pay gap. Okay. And that's really, really hard. It's really hard to deal with. It's really hard to talk about. It's really hard to mitigate for. But the way you mitigate it is through representation. That's how you change the gender pay gap. You get parity at work in terms of representation. Now, I'll get off this point in a little bit, but it is very topical, and I think it's important to understand. But it's always a mystery to me. Well, not exactly a mystery, but it's funny to me that when you print a diversity annual report, I'm sure some of you will have seen the sorts of things that tech companies like mine put out. When I worked at Google, I wrote Google's diversity annual report for 2018, 2019. So I'm very across all the sorts of things we're thinking about when we're doing those reports. And we're mainly thinking, oh my goodness, it is so devastating that we do not have fair representation, right? And you can see that for gender, you can see that for underrepresented racial groups. And you can also, if companies publish self-ID data, which I can talk about separately, you can see the representation for the LGBTQ plus community, and also for example, first generation students, so a proxy for socioeconomic status. But anyway, when we look at that in a diversity annual report, people read the reports and they go, oh, at Snap, only 20% of women. Well, in fact, last year that's because we've made progress. It was only 16.7% last year of our tech org were women. So they see that statistic and they go, oh dear, that's terrible, which it is. And then they go back to their work. If you translate that statistic into the pay gap, you find that our pay gap is like it depends which exact figures you're using. Are you looking at the mean pay gap? Are you looking at the median pay gap? I won't go into all those details, but depending on which one you use, the pay gap ranges from 35% to above 55%. And when you tell people that, they suddenly lose their mind. And they'll even, I don't mean to say even the men, that this is what I love about your generation is men and women equally understand that both need parity, and also for non-binary communities as well. I should have started with my pronouns, she, hers. See, learning on the job every day. But so what I'd love you to think about is the difference in reaction you get to essentially the same data point, but depending how you present it. So what that legislation did was to translate something that people see all the time in diversity annual reports and go, oh dear, that's a shame. And then you translate it into what happens to the money when you have that lack of representation. And suddenly it's like, oh my God, we must change this as soon as we possibly can. And that really is the conversation that I wanted to spark as a legislator, someone in the legislature putting that through. So that's life of a chief diversity officer, trying to work in those areas around a representative workforce, an inclusive culture, inclusive product. I don't want to talk for too long, but I do want to give you some insight into the ACT report. So I'm going to ask if we could pull up the slides at slide 4. I am going to whip through it quite fast because I do want us to get onto your questions. And so I wanted to, if we can go on to the next slide, I wanted to let you know the goals of the ACT report, which are to align the tech industry collectively, right? So that we can take action and basically to overcome failure. We've been in this sort of state of incremental progress for far too long. And of course, we wanted to actually publish the report. Where is my report? Here is my report. You probably can't still see me because I'm a little square now. But anyway, if we go on to the next slide, you'll see who was on the actual working group. And this had your own professors and your own thought leaders. So Iris and Siri, can't thank you enough. Their involvement came out of me cold calling Siri, well, sorry, no, not Siri. Siri was a joy who came to my life later. Cold calling Iris on LinkedIn and just saying, hi, you don't know me, but I'd love to work with you on this. And I am forever grateful that Iris agreed. So you can see there the groups. If we go on to the next slide, you'll see the recommendations. These are the most important recommendations, 4 of them, under which are laddered 10 actions. And I know many of you may have looked at the report. I'm not going to say you would have necessarily done that if you hadn't had to do it for your coursework. But you know what? My dad, I studied political philosophy as a student. I know, why did I do that? I don't know, it's ridiculous. But anyway, I remember getting my reading list, and my dad is an academic at Morehouse and Emory, and his book was on one of my course reading lists, and I still never read it. So all those that still haven't read anything about the ACT report, this slide is for you. Those of you that did have a look, I am grateful. So the first thing we have to do is to really model and incentivize inclusive leadership. And this comes from the point that if your leaders aren't doing it, really the rest of it is futile, right? Because leadership comes from the top. And it's not like they have to be engaged in it from morning till night, but if they don't understand some of the key principles, then an actual organization isn't going to be able to drive it through. Because the key lesson of the ACT report is that you do have to integrate your diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy with your business strategy. And I've been in this space for like 20 years, and believe me, they were always separate. And, you know, if we learned one thing, it is that separate is never equal. And it was never equal. And diversity strategies failed And often the reason they do still fail is because they are not actually integrated into the business plan, which brings us on to the O, operationalize DEI throughout the business. And that you have to do it the same way you would do any other business imperative, right? You give it resource, and there are timeframes, and there is accountability, and there is rigor. You don't just put your finger in the air and go, oh, I hope we get more women in here. No, that's not how it works, right? You really got to be able to operationalize. And that's what the ACT report sets out to do, is to provide a blueprint, a roadmap for the people that need to work out, what do I do? The next is that you've got to be able to share the data and metrics. We all know, you have learned many times, if you do not measure it, you cannot manage it, you cannot track it, you cannot improve it. And then the last one, T, is transforming pathways into tech. And that means looking at some of the huge systemic barriers that go way, way back beyond someone turning up for their first interview for a job in tech, right? And that's about the education system and the huge amount of educational inequity that is built in every part of the system. I mean, I remember when I was at Google, and basically, I'm going to talk quite top level here. Actually, this has been recorded, isn't it? Let me think about the words I use. I was going to paraphrase, and when I paraphrase, I kind of say things I probably shouldn't. But I was going to say that we basically were having a conversation in a nutshell going, oh my God, why are these Black engineers not passing our entrance coding exam, basically? And, these students from, I don't know, let's say Morehouse, are not passing this exam, whereas these students from Stanford, they are knocking out the ballpark. Oh, and these students are 98% white, and these students are 98% Black. Is it just, what is it? Well, there are many, many, many reasons, going back to the systemic issues I alluded to. But another issue was, hey, guess what? The Stanford kids had an entire semester course that they attended called How to Pass the Google Technical Interview. So I put it to you that if you do not actually work to just give a smidgen of a level playing field before people go into these very high pressure environments, then you're not going to come out the other side with any equity. Anyway, what are we asking people on the ACT, companies who sign the ACT report, to do? If we can go to the next slide, you'll see we're asking them to develop a strategy so that they are, actually using the ACT report to see where they have gaps and measure how they can improve, which brings on to the second point, the demographic data. We want them to give that data to a proposed industry body team, which is called the Tech Equity Accountability Mechanism, and SNAP is funding it and are incubating it. And then we want to be able to create collective action at an industry level, instead of us all going off 1,000 flowers bloom and actually the industry itself doesn't move forward. Now, talking of the industry itself, on the next slide, you'll see the actual companies who signed up to the ACT report, and that is incredible. Quite honestly, it was terrifying. I think maybe 7 weeks before we were going to press, we did not have one single confirmed signatory. We had a ton who were like, oh, this looks amazing. Oh, this is incredible. Oh, we really should. Oh, we're trying. We've got to get sign off from our policy team and from our legal team and from our CEO's office and from this and that and all. And me and my team were just like, oh my God, what are we going to do? You've got to have nerves of steel, and you've always just got to keep going, because if you don't keep going and it's your initiative, who else is going to keep going on it? And in the end, we got an incredible list across the line. That doesn't even include all of them. You'll see a small one at the bottom left says Alliance for Global Inclusion. Just that alone includes Dell, Intel, NASDAQ. I mean, huge, big companies, right? And so, yes, I am really proud of what we did with the members of the working group. We met every other week for 1 year, to discuss the issues, come up with our recommendations, and these are the ones that we managed to get across the line. So what next? Next slide, you will see that the ACT report recommended the Tech Equity Accountability Mechanism, which I mentioned, and we are now in the process of convening that. The first convening is next month, and it is going to exist to translate the vision and recommendations of the ACT report into actual measurable collective action. And we need to hold everyone accountable. So you can see what team is setting out to do, create cross-industry standards for reporting. It's an idea that I introduced in the UK, and I want to see it happen in the US. It is really to come together and realize that we can either, we can either win together or lose together. And at the moment, we're kind of losing together. So let's come together for that collective action. And also, really importantly, we really want to get innovation into the DEI space. Like I said, there is some incredible work going on, but instead, DEI, even notwithstanding the brutal and devastating murder of George Floyd and the racial awakening and reckoning that happened after that, and the equity reckoning that happened after that, even despite all of that, innovation is too often missing from the DEI space, and too often DEI is thought of, the mental model that accompanies it is compliance. It's like, oh my God, have I broken the law here? Do I need to tick the box there? That's a compliance mentality. Now, I'd be the first to say I do need you to tick the box when you're being asked to fill out your self-ID data, for example. That's really important. But actually, I ask people to tick the box to smash the box, right? Okay, because the work we do is to let people get out of the boxes that limit them. And this brings me on to the last piece that I wanted to mention today before we open this up for questions. And that is, next slide, you can see around how do you actually make people act? Like, instead of just like, oh, let me tick the box, like, how do you make people actually care and be passionate and want to do something? And also, it's so overwhelming, isn't it? It's just utterly overwhelming. You think about systemic sexism or racism or homophobia or transphobia, or the problems and the terrible inequity facing people with disabilities, for example, or those from lower socioeconomic groups. Incidentally, can I say I've got 4 kids, and 2 of them go to public schools and 2 of them go to private schools, and every single day it kills me the difference in opportunity there. I mean, it just, as a mother who literally sees it, like one of my kids, I think is, well, she just got into, so is going to be going to, like, I don't know, I think it's like it's in the top 5 in America for basically resource. It's like ending up where you guys are. At Harvard. In fact, it's called Harvard Westlake. And I go and see the facilities there, and which I did this weekend. And then I look at my kid, like my 8-year-old is in a class in LA in a very low income area for the kids that go there. A lot of the families, I should say, it's not necessarily a low income area, it's Venice, it's next to Venice High School, it's predominantly Hispanic. And when we arrived, so this was 2 years ago in LA, he's 6 years old. 3 years ago, he was 5 years old. I got a request from the teacher, could the parents chip in? I was thinking, oh, maybe it's for computing equipment or something. No, it was for a mat for the kids to sit on. They didn't have money for a mat for the 5-year-olds to sit on, right? So it literally breaks my heart. Every single day, it breaks my heart. And then the funny thing is, the kids who go to the well-resourced rich schools basically go, oh, we just did so much better on those exams, didn't we? Oh, I'm sitting in a classroom of 15 people, and I guess I just knocked it out of the ballpark. And oh, that one, they, you know, they did less well, those other kids, but do they know that they're in a class of 32 people? My kids are in a class of 32. And then the ones that go to private school get into a class of 14. I mean, anyway, sorry, I shouldn't go too wildly off on that subject, but literally every single day it kills me. So if we move on to the next slide, and I'll try and move on to the next topic, we call in the ACT report, we cite it. It is actually called preparatory privilege. That is the privilege you get when you go to a really well-resourced educational institution. So I've had that privilege when I went to university. You are getting that privilege right here, right now. So notwithstanding all of that, when people are asked, what should I do or what could I do around DEI, imagine, I mean, look, it's not anyone's fault if they either have a great school or a terrible school. It's not anyone's individual fault, but it is all our responsibility. Every single one of us has a responsibility to try and level that playing field. And I would argue, if we are the ones that got that preparatory privilege, we have an even greater responsibility, because hey, guess what? We got that privilege and we should invest that time and effort. And I know so many of you do that, which is why you turn up at a course like this. And I am super grateful to you for that. So if we can move on to the next slide, what the 3I action framework basically does is it says, hey, you need insights. And too often when people say, sorry, I know there's a lot of text on that slide, but when people say, what should I do? The answer is think of 3 things. Start with the first I, which is internal. And in fact, we can go to the next slide. If people want to ask questions, I can share these slides with you later. But the first thing is change your thinking, okay? I'll give examples for each of these. When you change your thinking, then you could change your interactions. The second I is interpersonal. How are you actually going out and interacting with people who don't come from your background, who don't have either your advantage or disadvantage or your point of view? How do you deal with those interpersonal interactions? And remember, that area is where the whole world of microaggressions live, which all the data shows us is why women and underrepresented minorities and other underrepresented groups leave the tech industry and other companies earlier than those from majority groups. It's here in this area, interpersonal, right? And as well as, obviously, there are systemic issues. So 3, how are you going to change the institution and change the system? So change your thinking. That allows you to change your interactions, your behavior. That allows you to change the system. And I'll give you one example. When I was a member of parliament, actually, I remember someone saying, hey, we've got a challenge for you. You need to spend 24 hours in a wheelchair. And I was like, of course I'll spend 24 hours in a wheelchair. Of course, how hard can it be? Well, I couldn't get to work for a start. I couldn't get on the metro, the underground. I basically couldn't do anything. And I realized I had never understood my privilege as an able-bodied person. I had just never understood it. Same thing around LGBTQ+. One of my kids identifies as non-binary. Just the aggro she gets in my own living room, let me be clear here, with the other kids is like, oh my God, I didn't have to deal with that. You know, it's hard, right? It's hard out there dealing with these things. And it's even harder being able to recognize your own privilege and how you can use it to change the experience of those in an underrepresented group who have so many things weighted against them, okay? Most of all the system, but also those interpersonal behaviors that change whether you believe you belong in a place or not. So I know we've had slides up for far too long. I am going to ask if we can come out of the PowerPoint presentation, even if it's Google Slides. And I am going to stop talking there, because you can probably tell, as a recovering politician, I could talk for another 3 hours, would rather wait my conversation or what I'm talking about around your questions. So with that, I'll hand it back over to Iris and Siri. But thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Oona.